CEO and co-founder. There's a lot of news, of course, in Rhode Island. A new candidate has jumped into the Democratic primary, Matt Brown. That makes 4. You can see an analysis on GoLocal. Also, maybe the most haunted house in Rhode Island is now on the market. GoLocal had that this morning. And an emerging problem with the pandemic is there's no school bus monitors, and parents are speaking out about that problem. You can take a look at that article as well. But if you think we've got problems here, we're going to talk about Washington, D.C. and the Biden administration with Jennifer Lawless, the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia. Madam Chair, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm happy to be back.
Yes, we've missed you.
I missed you.
During the interim, Joe Biden's problems related to Afghanistan are beginning to pale in comparison to the laundry list of complex and significant issues that the White House is trying to deal with right now. Let's go to their problems with Congress, primarily with Democratic Congress members. Infrastructure bill plus the $3.5 billion spending bonanza, kind of New Deal type package. You've got these 2 pieces of legislation, monumental in scope. You would think Democrats could get a handshake and get these 2 bills passed ASAP.
Right, and that's not at all what's happening. And this is a clear example of the Democrats not realizing that if they, or maybe they do realize it and they're not ready to admit it yet, that if they don't come together, they're going to wind up getting absolutely nothing. I mean, it's striking to me, and it seems completely impossible that moderates and progressives would actually walk away from such a signature piece of legislation, even if they're not getting exactly what they want, even if it costs a little bit more than Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema want, even if it ultimately spends a little bit less than what some of the House progressives want. They need to unify because there are going to be no Republicans on board. And if they can't do this, then it really suggests that they can't do anything. And I know yesterday Steny Hoyer was saying that, meetings with the president are going to be the special sauce. He knows what it takes. No one person is going to be able to resolve these tensions if the members of the House and the Senate together don't believe that this is better for the American people than not passing anything. And it just seems like a no-brainer to me. So I'm pretty stunned.
Yeah, I mean, the post-Trump era was functionally a mandate to Democrats. They had the House, they had the Senate, yes, not big margins, but the way to be able to maneuver the rules to be able to get most anything they need to get done. And obviously, Biden in the White House. There was a lot of forward momentum. The president had decent poll ratings. This is all spun out of control. And it really does appear to be, you can't blame this one on the Republicans. You've got majorities in both bodies, and these things were constructed in a way that you didn't need a Republican, and you didn't have to deal with cloture votes and things like that.
Right. I mean, I would say one thing, which is that it's the slimmest majority possible. And so not having any Republican support means that you really can't have any Democrats step out of line here. It's part of the reason why people like Joe Manchin have been able to make the kinds of demands that they've been able to make. But what I really think the Democrats need to realize is that they're not playing against some hypothetical team. They know how the Republicans play. Republicans generally don't air their dirty laundry. They don't have fights in public. When a piece of legislation gets put on the agenda, it passes. And they ultimately wind up dominating the news cycle with their successes. For the last 2 weeks, and it's been longer than that, but the last 2 weeks in particular, the Democrats have just demonstrated an inability to work together to get things done that they all agree are better for the country. And so the level of dysfunction looks pretty high, and it's no surprise that congressional approval is down, favorability toward Democrats is down, and Joe Biden's approval rating is down because the American people mostly don't understand how a bill becomes a law, and they think that this is his fault.
Yeah, I'll add this. I remember the time where the Republicans needed a vote. They brought in Pete Wilson, the senator from California, later the governor of California, on a stretcher to cast a vote because the Republicans wanted to win a vote. Listen, you don't need to bring anybody out of an ICU unit in this situation. You just need for the Democrats to show up and vote.
Right, and the other thing I would say that's really upsetting about this whole process, if you're thinking about why the Democrats are shooting themselves in the foot here, is that the Republicans have Fox News, and they have a media outlet, and they have a right-wing media, a cast of characters who are constantly willing to bash the Democrats and really not critique the Republicans. The Democrats don't have that. So if you turn on CNN, it's also pretty much all day, all the time, the Democrats' dysfunction. And so, the Democrats are becoming their own worst enemy. Nobody is going to sort of cover things up for them. They have to figure out how to come together and realize that in politics, there are compromises. Not everybody gets what they want, but moving forward with these two pieces of legislation means that the American people are going to be better off than doing nothing.
Yeah, not only are they going to miss out on some record spending bills that may potentially have a positive impact on the U.S. economy for a significant period of time, but there's some housekeeping, very significant passages that need to take place on the debt ceiling and on spending caps that could, if not adopted, could send Wall Street spiraling. The one part of the U.S. economy through all of this, go figure, has been Wall Street has been consistent in growth and returning a mass amount of wealth to many Americans. If that starts to spiral, then you're talking about really significant problems.
That's right. Although here, the Republicans are to blame, and the hypocrisy is almost unlimited. 80 times Congress has voted to raise the debt ceiling because we have a responsibility to pay our bills and to cover our debts. And this is not the time to have a broader conversation about why it is that we owe so much money, why it is that we spend more. These are costs that we've already incurred. These are debts that we've already incurred. The United States Congress constitutionally is responsible for paying for them. And so, there's so much dysfunction that this is yet one more way that we could ultimately really hurt our own credit rating. We can hurt the social spending programs in this country. And at the end of the day, it's both Democrats and Republicans that have voted for legislation that we now have to pay for. And so it's just very, very irresponsible. A government shutdown would be an absolute disaster at this point. I don't think that we'll get there, but constantly being on the brink of one is also just, it doesn't look good. Not to mention the fact that the debt ceiling debate coupled with the infrastructure bill, Democrats are already likely to lose a lot of congressional seats, right? The question is now if there's any path to maintaining a very, very slight majority in the House. If they don't manage to pass this legislation, if they ultimately wind up bringing us into a government shutdown, it's game over.
Yeah, I think it's, very, very, very razor-thin margins and a lot of just self-inflicted complications here. This infrastructure bill should have been done 6 months ago, taking the victory lap, lots of ribbon cuttings, lots of putting people to work, lots of shovel-ready projects, all that sort of stuff. Would have had a much different tenor and given the president really a significant win. Right now, it's just getting more and more complicated. Let's jump over to some foreign relations issues. One is, and this one is now emerging into an international issue, is this border, this very visible border issue with a significant number of Haitian refugees. This morning, a senior U.S. diplomat in Haiti resigned, claiming that the Biden administration was being inhumane to the Haitian problem and Haitian refugees seeking asylum in the United States. There's visuals from the border of these folks being, pushed back with border control officers on horseback. The visuals were immediately criticized across the board. This is an ongoing problem. It's an ongoing problem for all presidents. But the problem with Biden versus Trump was Trump looked like he was in charge and doing things. Biden looks like he's constantly trying to catch up and find a solution.
Well, I think the other issue there is that Trump, if he treated migrants like this, or if he was sending them back on these repatriation flights, or if he was making people who haven't been in Haiti for 10 years or 12 years go back there, he took that as a win. And so it wasn't only that he looked like it was in charge, he looked like these inhumane policies were something that he was embracing. And so I think that complicates things as well. But you've also got, the Department of Homeland Security saying, oh, this is terrible. We want to look into it more. We don't support this. This is your job. What do you have to look into? Stop it. I just think that, this is one of these situations where you've got to make decisions, and you've got to make them fast. No, it's not okay to have 12,000 and then 8,000 people living under a bridge on the border, but they are there. And we as a nation have to do more, I think, than just raise the limit of people that we're allowing into the country, and acknowledge that this is a huge, huge problem right now. And sending people back to a war-torn country that's recently been ravaged by natural disasters is not a viable solution. It's just, the whole thing's very disappointing. And if any one of these things was happening at once, if it was the infrastructure bill, if it was the debt ceiling, if it was Haiti, if it was Afghanistan, you could imagine a scenario whereby the president would deploy a special task force to investigate the problem. There would be press conferences. There would be a solution. It's like things are coming in all directions, from all directions. And it just seems like it's too much. And that's becoming, I think, a pretty untenable position for this administration.
Well, we're not done with the list. Let's go to France. One of our closest allies, France, is, let's put it this way, not pleased with us based on what appears to be, whether it was good foreign policy or good interest in our national defense, a secret deal brokered by England with Australia that also smells of payoff to U.S. defense contractors providing nuclear submarines to Australia, Australia thus canceling the biggest arms order that the French defense industry has ever had. The president of France has lost his mind. Has there been a phone call? It's been 2 weeks that they can't seem to find the calling card to be able to find the French president's phone number. Where are we with our French allies?
I heard the French ambassador say yesterday that the delay is because they have to really, really plan this call. So I think the phone numbers are there. I think how not to scream at the president is probably what's holding up the call. This is one of those things that I think in the broad scheme of things is probably not that significant. France is not going to write off the United States. Biden will call. They'll make nice. There won't be complete trust for a little while. And ultimately, I think we'll be okay. This is one that doesn't affect most American people on a daily basis. There are, fortunately for the Biden administration, there's not visual that CNN can be rolling all day or that Fox News can be rolling all day. It's certainly not helpful. But the fact that we didn't spearhead the deal, and the fact that it's a head of state who is, whose best interests are to continue to be aligned with the United States, mitigates, I think, some potential disaster. But it's certainly not good. Look, if these other things weren't going on, this would be a huge, huge problem, and this would be getting way more attention than it actually is. But I actually think that in the broad scheme of things, it's a pretty minimal blip for the administration.
Okay, I'm going to give you a win on France as not being a major. I do have the sense that the president will promise the French president that we are going to buy a lot of French wine worth billions of dollars for the National Park Service concierge concession stands. But let's go to another one, which has turned into what appears to be a self-inflicted problem. I'm not sure President Biden wasn't correct on this one, but calling for booster shots to be implemented quickly. Israel, who's had the best science, the best data, is way ahead of the United States and has already been 2 months into giving booster shots after, I believe, 6 months to everyone over 50 years of age. President Biden said by September 20th, the U.S. would have a similar style policy. The FDA's advisory opinion, and thus the FDA today, undid that and came up with their own policy, which is only those 65 and older and those have significant health issues will receive the booster shots. How does this happen?
Well, there was one additional category that they didn't talk about last week that they mentioned today, which is people who have occupationally higher risk. So I assume that means it could potentially mean hospital workers or certain educators or people that come into contact with greater propensities of people who are not vaccinated. But it's certainly not a mass approval for the booster shot. You know, I've gone back and watched the footage multiple times, and I've also read what the Biden administration has said several times. And basically, they constantly said, and they were very consistent in saying, pending FDA and CDC approval, on the 20th, we will move forward with a booster shot plan. The infrastructure is in place. I don't think it occurred to them that they would not have the FDA or the CDC approval, but this is not an about face. I mean, they were very clear to caveat that the science would drive this. Now, why the FDA decided to go down this path is a different question altogether. And I don't know the extent to which politics played a role. I don't know the extent to which they felt like, oh, well, the president is all of a sudden telling us what we should do. We're not going to do this, versus the Israeli data really were basically for older people, and they want to gather more information about the efficacy and the decline in the virus's effectiveness in people under the age of 50. But, you know, it does look, it looks like a loss. It looks like the administration sort of doesn't have a complete handle on the virus. And frankly, you know, for people like me who are in their 40s who got vaccinated pretty early on, I'm kind of like, I would like a booster, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, we know that, okay, so if somebody who's in their 50s, we know the efficacy is going down. Chances are somebody in their 40s, it's going down too. We know that they're safe, and there just hasn't been any discussion about the timeline as to when we would expect new data, so that, you know, when people are 8 months out, they know whether they're likely going to be able to get this vaccine or not. So it's public relations wise, I think it was not great. And I also think that the administration should have come out far more directly after the FDA and CDC decisions to explain what's going on, and they didn't.
So, you know, perception's reality, reality is often perception. Does the president need to shake things up? New chief of staff, new press secretary, new something. I would say a new vice president, but she has been MIA, have not seen or heard from her in months, and I mean months, in any substantive way. She showed up at a couple of Afghan-related press events, but had no meaningful role in those. On the border discussion, where she was supposed to be the lead in some aspects of the border issues, she has disappeared as well. What does the president do to hit the reset button?
I think a lot will depend on whether this infrastructure bill passes in the next month or so. I could imagine that there will be no shuffling of anybody in the short term, just because at this point the administration doesn't believe that they've done anything wrong. I mean, there's been a lot that's been thrown at them, and they've been trying to handle it. But, you know, I think that they're looking at these as all individual crises. If the infrastructure bill can't get through, then I think that demonstrates an inability to work effectively with Congress, and there a potential shakeup might be required. Similarly, but I actually still believe that that's going to go through. The other place where I could imagine something happening is at the border. I don't know if that means replacing somebody very high up, but I could see there being some sort of major shift there, because this is just not acceptable, and it is inhumane, and it doesn't look different than it looked during the Trump administration. And the Democrats don't believe that this is the way that we should conduct foreign policy. They also don't believe that this is the way that we should handle immigration issues. And the Biden administration doesn't either. And so I just think they're not, for whatever reason, they're not able to implement what their vision is, and they're not able to solve this problem.
Well, we ran through 9 issues. I give due respect to the office of the president, did not include Afghanistan on the list of issues that I'd identified before we came on air. Let's add Afghanistan. That is 10 issues. We're talking about a major meltdown of a relationship with one of our closest allies, and you want to take that one off the list and put that one aside. So we're down to 9. 9 major issues, some of which have profound political importance, and some have profound American issues, like a government shutdown in the middle of a pandemic. Can you even imagine?
No, but what I will say is that we, as people who are obsessed with politics, are also a little bit histrionic in our predictions. I really don't think that we are going to have a shutdown. I do think that we will raise the debt ceiling. I do think the infrastructure bill will go through. So I think that I do think that Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron will speak and we'll be okay. So I think that half that list is ultimately going to get resolved relatively quickly. But the problem is that all of this was dirty laundry, legitimate dirty laundry that was aired, and it basically cuts away at confidence in the administration's competence. And that's a major problem, especially during a pandemic. You want to believe that your government knows how to work for you. And whether it's right or not, the president is ultimately responsible for all of this. And to see the way that this is already beginning to trickle down, as of this morning, Donald Trump's current approval rating is higher than Joe Biden's. In Virginia, which has become a pretty solid blue state, Terry McAuliffe, who was a very popular governor who reigned during the Charlottesville KKK visit several years ago, he's now down 3 points in the gubernatorial race. Like, this is craziness. This demonstrates that this administration needs some wins, and they need to get out of the spotlight some of these issues that look like they just have lost control of the country. And some of that is better relationships with the media. Some of it is actually just doing a better job.
Yeah. And keeping control of those progressive members of the House and those more moderate, if not conservative, members of the United States Senate, neither of which, they all ran free for about 7 to 10 days, chirping at each other, and they look like Democrats versus Republicans, not Democrats versus Democrats. You get the last word.
Well, the one thing I would say there too is that, it does you absolutely no good if you're going to lose control to have won this race, right? To have won this fight. So if you're a progressive Democrat, look, I'm a progressive Democrat. I believe in everything that they're seeking, but I also think that it would be way better to get less than that and potentially maintain control of the House of Representatives, because otherwise, when the Republicans are in control, they're going to get nothing. And I just think that you need to look at the medium and the long-term strategy here. And all we're seeing from both the progressives and the moderates in the Senate is a very, very short-term strategy that's ultimately a victory for the Republicans.
You get the last word. What should Americans and Rhode Islanders be looking at over the next week?
I think the biggest issue, the biggest short-term issue, is going to be discussions about the debt ceiling and the extent to which the economy could potentially falter if the government doesn't ultimately pay its debts, raise the debt ceiling, and figure out longer-term solutions. So I would say that that's going to be the main headline for at least the next 48 or 72 hours.
Could the agreement to increase the debt ceiling be the death nail to the $3.5 trillion kind of New Deal public spending bill?
I think that bill is already dead on arrival. You've got Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema saying under no circumstances would they vote for that price tag. What has now happened is that their leverage has even been chipped further away because it's now being linked to the debt ceiling. So I don't think 3.5 is in the cards at all. The question is how far away from 3.5 do the Democrats wind up?
Jennifer Lawless, as always, thank you so much. Hopefully we'll have you back next week. For everybody else, stay tuned. Lots of updates. Check in nonstop. E-blasts are always going out. If you haven't gotten vaccinated, help the Rhode Island economy, help your family, help your friends stay healthy. Every day we post obituaries. You can read between the lines, and there's 2 or 3 obituaries of people who are unvaccinated who have passed away from the coronavirus. Thanks, everybody. Stay tuned.